While the U.S. continues to employ extraterritorial measures against Cuba, Iran, and other countries, it has done so in the face of significant opposition and public outcry from the international community. At the very least, it is surely embarrassing for the U.S., which regularly denounces Cuba for its human rights violations, to find that nearly every country in the world joins with Cuba in annually denouncing the U.S. for its violations of international law in this regard. In the last decade or so, we have seen the emergence of a second strategy by which the U.S. has magnified the scope of its unilateral measures, such that their impact becomes nearly global. This was evident in an obscure incident in 2012 when an Iranian-American college student in Alpharetta, Georgia, entered an Apple store to buy an iPad while speaking to her uncle in Farsi. The store refused to sell her the iPad because of her ostensible ties to Iran. She was not on any U.S. terrorist list. But the sanctions regimes employ a strict liability standard, imposing severe penalties for selling technology even inadvertently and indirectly that ends up in Iran. Around the same time, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, began imposing massive fines on foreign banks and companies for violating U.S. sanctions regimes on Cuba, Iran, and elsewhere. These included a penalty of $619 million imposed on the Dutch bank ING in 2012. Penalties totaling almost $9 billion were imposed on the French bank BNP Paribas in 2014. BNP was also partially and temporarily denied access to the U.S. Federal Reserve, sending a chill through the international banking community. In March 2015, the German bank Commerzbank AG was required to pay a total penalty of $1.45 billion. There were massive fines imposed on other financial institutions as well, including HSBC and Crédit Agricole Corporate. What has now emerged in response is an extensive practice of overcompliance. Professor Alena Douhan, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures and Their Negative Effects on Human Rights, has defined overcompliance as a form of excessive avoidance of risk. It may involve blocking all financial transactions with a sanctioned country, entity, or individual, even when some transactions are authorized by humanitarian exemptions or fall outside of the sanctions scope. It may also take the form of deterring authorized transactions by requiring cumbersome, onerous documentation or certification, charging higher rates or additional fees, or imposing discouraging long delays. Overcompliance also occurs when banks decide to freeze assets that are not targeted by sanctions or deny individuals the possibility to open or maintain bank accounts or to engage in transactions simply because they are nationals of a sanctioned country, even when the individuals are refugees from that country. Douhan has noted that unilateral sanctions regimes create a generalized fear among different stakeholders who constitute key players in the performance of otherwise authorized activities in connection with a sanctioned country, and result in instances of overcompliance and de-risking with catastrophic consequences on the general populations, let alone the most vulnerable. In practice, overcompliance is driven by three conditions. First, the terms of the regulations are irreducibly vague. The due diligence requirements, such as Know Your Customer (KYC), are never made fully explicit. A bank, shipping company, insurer, or other company may be held responsible for the acts of its customer, so it must determine whether its customer may, for example, ultimately send the funds or goods involved to a sanctioned country or an individual listed as a specially designated national (SDN), either directly or indirectly. Further, in some contexts, a private actor must not only know its customer, but must also know its customer's customer, KYCC. That is, the responsibility of the private actor may be expanded exponentially. In addition to due diligence, other key terms are also irreducibly vague, such as the prohibition on providing material support to a terrorist organization. For example, the U.S. law Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act of 2017, GATSA, in part targets those involved in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The law imposes secondary sanctions on individuals and entities, including those that are not U.S. nationals, if they knowingly facilitate significant transactions for persons who are listed by the Treasury Department in relation to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. While the Office of Foreign Assets Control offers some guidance on the factors it will use in gauging whether a transaction is significant in this context. OFAC noted that the guidance it provided was not exhaustive, and they emphasized that they would take a case by case approach. Because OFAC ultimately exercises considerable discretion in determining whether there has been a violation, banks and other private actors do not have complete clarity as to how they should interpret and implement the regulations. Second, the penalties for violations are not just severe, they are potentially catastrophic. Thus, the risk that is at play is not an ordinary one. Commercial actors, whether banks or others, routinely determine that a given risk is acceptable as a cost of doing business, where it is outweighed by the likely revenues. But OFAC penalties are different in nature. They present not just a potential business loss, but rather the possibility of a catastrophic loss and an existential risk. In the case of BNP Paribas, the penalty was not only a massive fine, but also the temporary and partial suspension of access to the U.S. financial system. For any bank that engages in U.S. dollar transactions, and the majority of the world's financial transactions take place in U.S. dollars, denial of access to the U.S. financial system is known as the death penalty. While a private actor may conceivably decide that many kinds of risks are still worth taking, a risk such as that, which may effectively spell the end of the enterprise itself, is presumably unaffordable in any circumstances. Finally, the standard for the imposition of penalties is unforgiving. If penalties were imposed for, say, intentional wrongdoing, then assuring compliance is relatively easy. If penalties were imposed for negligence, then training programs and other measures could be taken to demonstrate that the actor is not negligent. However, the standard is strict liability, so penalties may be imposed even for violations that are inadvertent, where there is neither intent nor negligence.